Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. The ArchivesSpace Technology and Development Roadmap is a planning and communication tool to help our community know what to expect in terms of future development work and aid in planning for upcoming releases. Please note this webinar is being recorded. Today, we will explore the latest version of our roadmap, which has many content and format updates and provides a series of views targeted at the needs of different kinds of ArchivesSpace stakeholders. The roadmap documents can be found on the wiki. Presenting today, we have Christine DiBella, Program Manager for ArchivesSpace, who plays a key role working closely and collaboratively with the ArchivesSpace community, advisory groups, and governance board to set the strategy and goals for ArchivesSpace. With over 16 years of experience as an archivist in a number of academic and nonprofit settings, Christine is involved in all aspects of the program and serves as a key spokesperson and advocate for the program. Thank you for joining us today. Christine will now walk us through the new roadmap format and will hold for questions at the end.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks everybody for being here today. And happy 2018 to you that I haven't already made connections with this year. So here are the things that we're going to cover in the webinar today. First, I want to talk a little bit just in general about what a technology and development roadmap is and why we need one, if it's not obvious why we need one for the ArchivesSpace program. Then I'll talk a little bit about I'm not going to go in vast detail, but I will talk a little bit about our development planning process and how that relates to the roadmap. Then I'll walk you through the new views for the roadmap and kind of give you an idea of what each of them is intended for. Though people can use any of the views that they find helpful, I just want to give you a sense of what we thought in putting together each of these views. And then just talk a little bit about what's next and sort of how things move on from the roadmap itself. And as Kim said, I'm happy to take questions and feedback at the end. So you can put those in the chat at any time, or you can just hold them for the end. So what is a technology and development roadmap? The idea of this document is to provide an overview of development work that's done over a period of time. So for the ArchivesSpace program specifically, this is the different kinds of work that's going to go on in the ArchivesSpace application over a period of time. Our roadmap is most specific, as most roadmaps are, for the closest period of time, the things where we have the fewest unknowns, and then going further out into the future, it's not quite as precise. But the idea is to give us a general sense of where we're going and to be able to communicate to others where we're going. So our roadmap indicates what development work is planned, who's responsible for it, whether it's developers within the program itself, whether it's people that we're contracting with to do development, whether it's something that we're leaning on different members of the community to get involved with. That's something that we indicate on the roadmap. We also indicate where it is in the process. One of the things that we've been really trying to convey with our roadmap over the last year is that development is not just putting code into the application. There are a lot of different things that go into getting new features and other things into ArchivesSpace. So we want to indicate where things are in the process, whether it's at a stage where we're just sort of gathering requirements together, whether we're putting a working group together the way we did for the public user interface and the staff interface, whether things have finalized requirements and now are ready to go on to a development stage, or we're seeking developers. Those are things that we indicate in the roadmap to give people a sense of, not just what it is, but where it is in the process. And then probably what is most important to a lot of you is giving you a sense of when something is going to be in the application. And one of the things that we're also trying to convey with our roadmap is there's all kinds of different work, not just in terms of the process for getting things into the application, but also different types of coding that goes, different types of things that go into the application. Some of them are things that you see. It's a big, splashy new feature that you're excited to try out. Other things are more on the side of infrastructure for the application, making it so that it can run better, or making it so that the different software dependencies that ArchivesSpace relies on are kept up to date. All these things are things that we want to convey in the roadmap. So why do we need a roadmap? Again, if it's not obvious, the roadmap really serves as a planning tool for the program and for people that use the application, as well as a way for us to communicate with each other about what's happening in the application and what's happening next. The roadmap is not, as you I'm sure are very familiar, the roadmap is not the only way we communicate information about what's happening in the application, but it's one precise document that gathers a lot of information together in one place. And our hope is that this will be, a very predictable place for you to look for certain kinds of information. The roadmap is useful for planning for upgrades. It's useful for determining the next steps for a particular feature and when it's going to be available for users. It's also a way for people to identify ways to get involved in specific development projects. So if you have a feature you really care about and you identify where it is in the process, the roadmap will help you determine, maybe some ways that you might be able to get involved, you or your institution. And I did mention, some of the ways that those might be. Each institution has different ways that are going to be most appropriate for them to get involved, and depending on the feature, different times that it's appropriate to get involved. But we want to convey that to you in the roadmap, in addition to just what's happening in the process. How our development planning process works. I'm just sort of hitting a few of the highlights that really relate to the roadmap itself. As many of you know, we have a development catalog in JIRA, and that's where every issue that people have and have noted, or things that they want for the application, have been kind of logged and indicated. And this starts back from sort of the beginning of the development process for ArchivesSpace. So there are things in our development catalog that were done 3 years ago, and things that were just requested this morning. So it's a pretty full record of all the different things that people want or have been done in the application. We have our Technical Advisory Council and our User Advisory Council. Those are appointed from the membership of ArchivesSpace. There are about 15 to 17 members of each of those councils. And there's a cross-council group called the Development Prioritization Subteam that features members of both of the councils and is really actively involved in prioritizing from that development catalog, what are the next things to be worked on as we have development resources to work on them. So our development prioritization subteam meets monthly to discuss both kind of the individual issues that have been logged, that have been submitted, as well as larger projects. So as you would expect, a number of things rise above just a single issue. It's a more holistic thing. It's a set of features that people want. In the case of our staff user interface effort that was just concluded, in terms of the recommendations coming in, there are going to be a lot of different projects that come out of those sets of recommendations. So the development prioritization subteam represents the membership in helping the program team determine sort of what the priorities are and how to sequence different things. The ArchivesSpace team then sort of takes that information, as well as information that we hear directly from users, to determine the likely timelines for different projects. Some of that is based on, how quickly it can be done, what resources we have available to do it, how complete the specification is to do that work. How ready is it for us to just turn over to a developer and have them build into the application. Those things all go into us being able to figure out what an appropriate timeline is for the different projects and things that people want done. Once we've kind of figured out which projects are going to get worked on and what the sort of general timeline is for those. That's when we assign developers. Sometimes those will be developers that work specifically for ArchivesSpace. Sometimes they're contractors. Sometimes we have institutions that approach us about wanting to get involved, either by paying a developer to do work, or they have developers on their own staffs that are available to do the work. So these are all ways that we assign developers to different projects. No matter how developers are assigned, the developers work closely and under the guidance of our technical lead, Lainey McGlowan, and me. And as they deliver development for testing, we have another cross-council group, our testing sub-team, that does testing of the things that have been delivered. You also see that depending on how complex something is or how radical of a change something is, we will also often put out calls for wider testing beyond just the testing group. Because before we sort of finalize it and put it into a release, we want to make sure that we know that it's working the way people expect it to work, and that it's not interfering with other things that are going on in the application. When that testing determines the work is ready, then it goes into a release. And then each time the release comes out, then we update the roadmap to indicate what work has been done. As releases go out and as projects get done, that also gives us a better sense of projects that have yet to be completed, how soon they will be able to be completed. So all these things need to get updated in the roadmap as we have that information. The goal this year is to update each time a release comes out, so that a release will come out and then relatively soon after, the progress that's been made will also be reflected in the roadmap. As with anything in archives, this is a completely iterative process. So we don't get one release out and then rest back on our laurels and think that we're done. We know that we have to get another one out. We have more requests coming in. We have more projects that we have to prioritize. All of this is a continuous cycle. So our roadmap has really evolved as our community has grown and as the communication and planning needs of that community have grown. So if you've been involved with ArchivesSpace for a while, you've seen sort of different ways that we've communicated that information to you. This is this new version of our roadmap is a way that we're hoping will meet a lot of the needs that we've heard from people over time. But we're very interested in, as you use the roadmap, in you helping us identify additional needs you might have or ways that we can convey information better than we are currently. This version of the roadmap that we have now, Kim did a tremendous amount of work in putting together an Excel file that we could use to generate a series of different views that we think will be helpful for people that interact with ArchivesSpace in different ways and reflect kind of the different levels of information that they need based on how they interact with it. So Kim gave you the link for where our roadmap lives permanently, but I just want to walk you through a few of these views and kind of highlight who we think is going to be maybe most interested and helped with the different views. So the first view is something we call the full details view. And this looks, this is basically just taking the view that we had around this time last year, that we first put out around this time last year, and really conveys sort of everything that we think somebody who's really actively involved in ArchivesSpace might want to know about what's going on with development of different features and different kinds of work that's going on. So that includes, the feature itself or the work itself. It includes a link to a JIRA ticket if a JIRA ticket exists for it. It indicates where in that process that I mentioned it is, whether we already have full requirements for it or whether we're still seeking requirements for it, whether we're trying to put a working group together to investigate it, those kinds of things. Then there's a month-by-month listing that gives you a sense of when this is forecast to go into the application. There's different colors in the roadmap to indicate both things that are done as well as things that are intended to be done. Also colors to forecast, to signal to people, when we really need help with something. Um, so there's the columns to indicate when we think something's going to be done, as well as who is going to be responsible to do it, or whether we're seeking community help to get something done. And then something new we added in this version of the roadmap is an impact score. And the idea of the impact score is to give like a general sense of how big of a deal is this feature, how big of a deal is this change to the infrastructure. How much of a change is that going to make in both the application that a user sees as well as the way the application behaves. So that just, we think that's a helpful way to signal to people whether something is a big change or a small change. And it also gives you a sense of the relative effort. We can't, in every single release, we can't have every single thing that's in there be an incredibly high impact activity, because we wouldn't have the resources to do that. But we want to give you a sense of, with the resources that we have, how those are being allocated. So this view we think is probably going to be most helpful. Just pull something back up here. We think this view is going to be really, really helpful for our most, the power ArchivesSpace users and developers, people that are really in the application all the time, and not just kind of like in the application from the data entry perspective, but are in there like thinking strategically about how it's getting used at their repository, thinking about what things they need from the application to support their work better, as well as developers who are really looking for projects or talking with the archive staff at their institution about what is needed to improve the application to make it support their needs better. So that's what we think the full details view is going to be. Those are the people that are primarily going to seek that out, but of course anyone can use it if they find it helpful. We think it'll be especially helpful if you want to see the full picture of development being considered and worked on, if you want to track a particular feature through the whole development process, as well as if you want to identify opportunities for you and your institution to get involved in the development process. The next view that we have is a view to we are calling it the annual overview. And this is to give a sense of kind of over a year or over a certain period of time, what are the different things that are going into the application. And it strips out most of that detail that you saw in the full details view, and just kind of hits the highlights of what it is and what the impact of it is and when it's going to happen or when it has happened. So this is for someone we think that maybe isn't like so intimately involved in ArchivesSpace, but does work with it, or works with staff who work with it very closely. We think it's going to be especially helpful for administrators, system administrators, and others who need to know how the application has evolved or how it's going to evolve over a period of time, but aren't necessarily in the application itself working in there day by day. We think this will be especially helpful for people that are planning for upgrades, that kind of want to get a sense of where the application is going in a big picture way, over a year, over 2 years. That might be especially helpful for people who haven't yet deployed ArchivesSpace, but it could be helpful for anybody who has ArchivesSpace going but doesn't necessarily have the ability to do upgrades of it, every couple of months. And we also think that it might be helpful in just providing a sense of the level of activity around ArchivesSpace development to financial stakeholders when they're next considering, and you're helping them next consider membership, hosting, or other outlays of funds related to ArchivesSpace. Then we have a series of views for each release, either a release that has already happened or a release that is forecast to happen. That again, this really hits the highlights of what's going to go in each release, and it's really targeted to a single release, and to give you a sense of, okay, if you're going to install the January release, or if you're going to install the June release, what are all the things that are intended to be in there. I should say that the release notes that come out with each release will still have like the most detailed and most precise and most accurate information for a release. But this is to really give you a good sense of, what is the full package for a specific release. We think this is going to be good, especially for users and system administrators who need to know or what's planned to be in each release. So that can help you again with planning for upgrades. Also, if you're kind of a few versions back, it can help you with comparing what you have now with what is coming up, or what is in a release that has already come out that is different from the one you're on. And it may also help you in determining whether you actually need a particular release, whether you can hold off on that release for a while and skip it, or not build that into your upgrade plan for a while, or whether it has something, release has something that's really important to your institution and you want to prioritize based on your local interests and needs. And then the last view that we have is essentially our no words view. This is what we're calling an impact of enhancements view, and it really is just like taking that impact score and the different categories of development that we do, and indicating by each release what the relative impact is of the release overall, as well as within those different categories of development. We see this as a view that's going to be maybe especially helpful for high-level administrators and others that are less involved with the application. They know ArchivesSpace exists, but they don't know anything about it specifically necessarily, or want to know necessarily anything about it specifically, or they're just sort of less engaged with archives in general, but they know that ArchivesSpace for the staff that work for them is an important tool to get their work done. So we think this will be helpful because it gives a visual sense of the relative effort given to the different categories of development, and also gives a quick visual way to identify which releases are going to have during a year are going to have the most impact, as well as gives just a general visual sense of how actively the application is being worked on and developed. So as I said, the plan for this year and going forward as well is that each time we put out a release, we will also update the roadmap, and we will post an updated set of these views. The previous views will not go away. They'll be archived and still accessible, but what's sort of most accessible on our website will be the current views, the current updated views after each release. As I said, the release notes themselves will continue to be the way that you get the most detailed information and the most accurate information about what was actually in each release. That will be down to the level of individual JIRA tickets, individual GitHub tickets, all those kinds of things. But the roadmap will have, kind of hit the highlights of what was in each of those releases. And all development will continue to be tracked in JIRA and GitHub. So JIRA and GitHub are still going to be the places where you want to report issues, and the places where developers will commit specific code to address those issues. We'll also be promoting, so as I said, our roadmap highlights things and kind of helps you maybe visually identify things that we're looking for people from the community to get involved in, but we'll also be promoting specific development projects and issues that we're looking for community involvement in addition to the roadmap itself. And that's what I have for you today. I'm happy to answer any questions as well as take any feedback that you might have about the roadmap. And you're welcome to comment on the wiki page if you think of something later, or you're welcome to send something to us directly as well. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christine, for guiding us through the new roadmap. It looks like we have some questions coming.
So Christy Peterson has a great question about if we see something on the roadmap that we're interested in, would like more details on, or want to be involved in, how do we figure out who to contact? So I would say in general, the program team are your first point of contact for something, especially if in that column that indicates who's responsible for a particular thing. If it says a space over there, that means the program team. And often, if we're looking for community developers, it will say a space and community developers. So I would say use Lainey and me as your first points of contact if you're interested in getting involved in a particular project, or if you don't see something on the roadmap and you're wondering why it's not on the roadmap, or you have a great idea for something that's not there, Lainey and I should be your first points of contact. If in that responsibility column it indicates that there's a particular institution that has taken lead on that particular thing, then feel free to reach out to that institution. We don't put an individual contact name on there at this point. We're only putting an institutional name on there. So if you don't know who the particular contact would be for that project at that institution, sometimes people will have been really visible on the listserv, or will have announced something, on the listservs about who is getting involved in a particular project. But if you don't know that, again, turn to Lainey and me, and we'll be happy to point you in the right direction. So Leah Osborne asks how did we determine the levels of impact, and how do we define them? So Kim has done a great job of scrolling down to on the roadmap, an area that explains sort of how we determine. So we only used 3 levels of impact at this point to maintain our sanity. And down at the bottom of that full details view of the roadmap, there's an explanation of what we think is a 1 in terms of impact, what we think is a 2 in terms of impact, and what we think is a 3 in terms of impact. For this first stage, the program team were really the ones that, based on our knowledge and having talked to users and knowing sort of what people are clamoring for, knowing what, has a really, like, in terms of the infrastructure things, it's a lot of work to do, and it's going to make a big splash in the application. We went ahead and assigned levels of impact, but we would certainly love for that to be more of a conversation and a discussion in the future. So if you see something on the roadmap that is assigned a certain level of impact, and even in looking at the definition of what a certain level of impact means, you disagree with that substantially, we'd be interested in hearing about that, and we'd be interested in ideas for how people might want to get involved in a discussion of relative levels of impact for different features. Are there any other questions? So David Lowe has a question about how does a plugin become a candidate to be a part of the main product? Now, this is wonderful because you give me a chance to also promote some documents and policies that we've put together recently to give people more of a sense of, have a more transparent and thoughtful process about how we determine different types of development, whether they're appropriate for the application or not, whether they're appropriate for the core code of the application or as a plugin or not. So let me just locate this link, and then I'm going to put a link to some documents that we have put together. The most probably key one for this question is it's not necessarily entirely new in terms of being a process, but it's the first time we've sort of really explicitly explained how we come to decisions about when we're offered code from outside. An outside developer or an institution is looking to put something together for the application, how we evaluate it and determine that it should go into the core code of the application. Or in the case of a plugin, lots of people have built all kinds of amazing, great plugins that do all kinds of great things. We think plugins are great, but if it's something that everybody wants to have in their application, we'd love to encourage people that develop plugins to think about putting them into the core code. So if you go to that link, you'll see a step-by-step of how any kind of development, whether it's a plugin or whether it's core code, how we evaluate it to go, whether it's appropriate to go into the application or not. People can develop whatever they want for their own archive space, of course. They can offer any kinds of development to others that they want. But in terms of the core application, in terms of the application that comes with when you download and install ArchivesSpace from our GitHub repo, these are the things that we're thinking about and evaluating through that process. So we want to determine the level of interest in the community overall for that. We want to look at the functional specifications that you've put together that explain how it works and what problem it's intended to solve. We want to look at the technical implementation plan. We have a core committers group that Lainey leads and features different members of our development community that evaluate code that people submit, but also, can help in putting together a technical plan for getting code into the application. And then we do want to put it out to the community to gather more information on the particular specifications and whether there's anything that hasn't been considered and things like that. And if and when we make a determination that it's appropriate for the application, then we want to help you, develop a and things like that. So this document in the link gives you a sense of that process. There are also some other documents on our wiki that explain some things about the different options for code for ArchivesSpace that you can think about. If you have a great plugin that seems like it might be appropriate for more than just your institution, or might be a thing that maintain yourself anymore, but want to have the ArchivesSpace program maintained, we have a document that explains, in generalities about how you can turn a plugin into core code, and that would also go through that same evaluation process. You can turn it into core code, but we'll want to make a determination of whether it's appropriate for the ArchivesSpace application overall, not just your own ArchivesSpace. This was scheduled to be a short webinar, so I think we're at the end of our time, but if people do have other questions, I'm happy to stick around for a little while. And this webinar was recorded, so feel free to share the recording once it's posted with other people. And as I said, feel free to get in touch with the program team at any point. And when it comes to development, especially with Lainey and me, if you have ideas or questions, or especially if you want to get involved, we'd love to have you get involved. Thank you.